Hi there, my name's Satchkir Sandhu, and welcome to the first episode of my documentary, Stereotypical, in which we'll discuss negative stereotypes regarding Indigenous people and my personal experience with that. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this episode of this documentary, the production, the voiceover, the creation of this documentary was done on the lands of the Katsi, Semiahmoo, and Kwantlen First Peoples. I'm giving this land acknowledgement because it's very important to recognize where this is coming from. Not only the perspective that this is being shared from, but where this perspective is being shared from, because this land is extremely important. Continuing on, it's been many years since Canada became a sovereign state. The last residential school in Canada was reportedly shut down in 1996, and the Canadian government apologized for the suffering Indigenous Canadians were put through via residential schools in 2008. You would think that Indigenous struggles in Canada with the closing of residential schools and government enforced discrimination would heavily decrease. Unfortunately, in the following years, that was and has not been the case. The linked video is the public apology by Stephen Harper on behalf of the Canadian government, addressing Indigenous Canadians that were victims of residential schools and victims to government-enforced discrimination. So, many might ask, what followed after the Canadian government's formal apology? Since, as I just claimed, the intended decrease in discrimination against Indigenous people did not happen, and stereotypes were created, and we will get into that. In the aftermath of the government-issued apology in Canada, Indigenous people are still victim to harmful stereotypes to this day. These stereotypes are fueled by misconceptions and the struggles of few Indigenous folk, with negative media highlights being a large contender. Some of these stereotypes include the assumption that all Indigenous people are addicts, alcoholics, pay no taxes, live for free, and thrive thanks to the government. These stereotypes are untrue, backed up by no facts, and are existing proof that Indigenous people have become scapegoats for many to blame for their struggles. My personal views also evolved over time from being exposed to so many different perspectives growing up. I perceived it very emotionally too, and I was very careful about my openness with my views in public, and let's get into why. Growing up in a family of immigrants, no one knew much of Indigenous people. My parents didn't know, not my grandparents. However, our family members that grew up here did, and they did not necessarily have positive views. They let out their frustration on the cost of living, grocery prices, and more inconveniences in their lives by stereotyping Indigenous people for supposedly living great lives on benefits on their tax dollars. Of course, these were untrue stereotypes fueled by anger. Growing up around this, I also began to question the integrity of Indigenous people and whether or not they were truly decent and hardworking people. I was never open about my feelings because I knew of the backlash I would face. But my perspective never truly changed until I attended public school and was surrounded by different people. I previously attended a religious school in which I was surrounded by people, of course, that majority of them shared the same faith as I did, and many of the same ethnicity too. When I moved to public school, I met many Indigenous peers, all that came from many different backgrounds, and each had their own unique story. I realized that the beliefs I held about Indigenous people were just stereotypes. Another factor that made me realize they were harmful stereotypes was remembering that my family members had connections to very educated Indigenous people. That included doctors, lawyers, engineers, people that knew, like, that had degrees in computer sciences. They they simply hated on their race because they were angry about their struggle. Once I came to this realization, I began to do my research and realized how horribly inaccurate the stereotypical claims of my family members were. It made me realize how harmful their stereotyping was. These are some stereotypes I that we're going to debunk. Indigenous people pay no taxes at all. This is a very common stereotype and it's heard often. The only Indigenous people that are exempt from paying certain taxes are Indigenous people that reside on reservations. The only taxes that they are exempt from are sales, property, and income. They pay all other taxes. So this claim is just simply untrue. Indigenous people living in reservations lead the best lives. This one is heavily influenced, as I mentioned before, from my family, but I did hear it in public too. This claim has no proof to back it up. The truth is that most reservations are located in extremely remote areas of Canada, and facilities, basic facilities, human facilities, are very difficult to find and build in those areas because we don't have knowledge of the land. We don't know how to build on that land. We don't have we don't carry the same knowledge that the people of that land carry. Whether they be Indigenous people living on reservations or people that are not living on reservations. All Indigenous people are addicts/alcoholics. This is the most obvious stereotype. Anybody, I personally feel, anybody that has grown up in Canada has heard this stereotype. And this is simply a racist claim. A factor that largely influenced this belief was the media, which highlighted the struggles of addicts and alcoholics that were Indigenous. Their narratives were often polarizing, and it's why the stereotype became so popular. And to simplify, the media focused their attention highly on Indigenous people that were addicts and alcoholics. They highlighted that alcoholism and drug or substance use, substance addiction is fairly higher in Indigenous communities. While they did highlight these statistics, they never provided any reason as to why. The media made it seem as if the only reason, the only way this was possible was just because they were Indigenous, which is terrible, which is why the media is a really big contender to the creation and the popularity of this stereotype. All in all, there are many more stereotypes and social behaviors targeted against Indigenous people that cannot be discussed in this episode. But the main takeaway of this is that the stories of few Indigenous people are not the stories of all. Another takeaway that I believe is particularly important is to do your research. While stereotypes are always untrue and are used in a harmful way against people, it is our duty as smart, educated, and simply just empathetic human beings to stand up against the use of these stereotypes and cite the proper statistics to combat these stereotypes. On the point of having empathy, it is our basic human duty to have empathy, as I mentioned earlier, and to be compassionate towards others, to hear the stories of all those around us, to stand up for Indigenous brothers and sisters, let alone all brothers and sisters. We all bleed red. And that concludes this episode of this documentary. These are my references.